Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Making Milestones podcast. Today's episode is going to encompass some of my favorite topics to talk about, which are obviously like horse-related stuff, but also anti-capitalist, anti-establishment stuff, and just talking about the way the world functions today and some of the problems that I see with it and how I think that those problems kind of coincide with some of the issues that we experience in the horse industry, because I think that there's a pretty big connection, and I've had people tell me that there is no connection, but I think that it's important that we recognize, one, how human emotion will change how we approach horses and horse training, because our emotions are so crucial to our behavior. And two, how our own societal biases and belief systems influence how we see everything, including within the horse world. So I firmly believe that a lot of these things are all connected. And I think that a lot of the issues that we face that are outside of the horse world end up bleeding into the horse world and causing problems within it. So yeah, the reason why I like to talk about these things in tandem is I just think it gives people a more well-rounded perspective of why I see the world in the way that I do. Also, you're probably going to hear Queso frolicking around in the background and perhaps meowing a little bit. Queso is my new kitten, and he gets the zoomies. So if you hear him, I apologize. Like, my new microphone seems to be better at not picking up a lot of background noise, but just like as a caveat, I'm sorry. Not going to put him away because homeboy enjoys being near me and he's just vibing right now. But yeah, you might hear him frolicking around, and if you hear any like little meowing screams, he's probably just yelling at me to pick him up. And you might even hear some purring depending on if he sits in my lap or not, but I don't know if the mic will pick that up. Anyways, back to the topic. So yeah, I think it's important for us to talk about and like look at and unpack our own societal conditioning and biases and how that might bleed into the way that we perceive things. Like, the reason why I wanted to bring this up is that there's this notion in the horse world that horses need to have a job. And there's a bunch of different reasons as to why people believe this. Some people believe it because they want to have a horse that does something for them and they don't want to pay for a horse that they cannot ride. So they want a horse only when it can provide something for them, be it enjoyment through riding or actual work if they use the horse for farm stuff or whatever. There's also this belief that horses need to have jobs due to their desire to have jobs, that they're less happy without a job and that they've been bred to be working animals so that when they don't have jobs, they're inherently less happy. And I want to talk about both of these things and where I think these attitudes come from, because I don't personally believe them. I definitely used to. Even if you go to look at some of my older content, it might be something that I perpetuate in that content, but it's something that has since changed for me. I don't believe that they need to have jobs. I don't believe that horses have like an innate species need to want a job in order to be happy. I think that what leads people to thinking that is a combination of societal conditioning and then also having horses who have a lack of enrichment and fulfillment in their day-to-day life outside of riding, and therefore there's a perceived need of having to ride the horse and give the horse a quote-unquote job, because if the horse is not in work, they're bored and they're not getting enough of their needs met. So for example, horses who are living a stall to paddock lifestyle and who aren't getting enough turnout or socialization with other horses or enrichment outside of riding, they will seem to need a job because they're not getting enough fulfillment in their day-to-day life because they don't have much to do in a paddock. Like, for example, a dry lot paddock, especially when horses aren't being free-fed hay, they're generally just standing around. Like, they might run around a little bit, but they aren't wandering because there's no incentive to wander. They don't have friends to follow around. They don't have much space to wander in the first place. And if they're not being free-fed hay, they don't really have anything to do. And even if they are being free-fed hay, if it's all in one place, there's not incentive to move around. So what people will find is that these horses will have an excess of energy that hasn't been used in their day-to-day life and turnout, and that energy is going to come out and they're going to be more boisterous and excitable and more difficult to handle because of that. So people perceive that as the horse needing to have a job and being less happy when they don't have a job, when really the actual issue is a lack of enrichment and a lack of species appropriate care on a day-to-day basis for the horse. And this idea of needing to have a job is also perpetuated in human society, where we're taught that basically our whole lives, even throughout school when you're younger, before you get a job, that you're preparing to go into the workforce. And that's the whole purpose of all of this. And we're taught that we need to have a job in order to afford to live. There's that saying, the cost of living, which is an interesting saying if you really unpack what it means, because it's this idea that you have to inherently be able to pay and afford to live in the first place, and that you're not deserving of the basic necessities of life, like food, shelter, and water, unless you can afford them. And what this means is that if people can't be useful and productive in order to provide profit and labor in the world, that they're not perceived as being deserving of life, because there is a cost to life. And it's a really interesting concept if you think about it, because none of us asked to be born. None of us consented to being born. We're just put here on this planet, and then you're told that you're not deserving of food, water, or shelter unless you can afford it. And it's interesting when you look further into it and you see that there is an abundance of food on this planet, but we are withholding it intentionally if it cannot be profited off of. For anyone who's worked at a grocery store or a restaurant, they can attest to how much food that is perfectly edible is thrown out when it cannot be profited off of. And if you really unpack this concept, it's really kind of disturbing to think about, because there's people who are starving and who are living on the streets without shelter, but there's an abundance of empty houses and places that they could be going to for shelter. And there's also more than enough food. But the problem is that all of these things are not being made readily available to people unless they can pay for them. So we've created this notion that you need to be able to pay to live, and that if you can't do that, you're not deserving of the basic necessities of life. And then people project this onto their horses, where if their horse cannot provide something to them and work to justify the expenses the person has to pay for in order to keep the horse, that they aren't deserving of the care provided. Like, a lot of people justify harsh training methods and unfair workloads for horses on the basis of, oh, well, they need to have a job. Like, I pay for their life. The least that they could do is work an hour a day. Like, they only have to work an hour a day. I work 40-hour weeks. It's nothing. So no big deal. And they'll use this to justify putting the horse in highly stressful situations, because they have to be stressed at work and they have to work more hours. But horses don't follow a capitalistic system like people do. And also, at the end of the day, if we're choosing to get animals, I do think that we take on the responsibility of caring for them, regardless of whether or not they're useful. And the same applies to children and whatnot. Like, we take on the care of those creatures willingly, and they shouldn't have to be productive and useful to us or give anything to us in order for us to justify providing care for them. But it's something that we've normalized in human society, and we then see it being perpetuated and projected in every aspect of what we do. Because I firmly believe that we should be taking care of people as a community, even in the absence of them being able to provide work for us. People shouldn't have to be able to work a job and work a 9 to 5 in order to be deserving of food, water, and shelter. These should be things that at face value, everyone is just provided because they're needed in order for people to live fulfilling lives and also just survive in general. And we should be operating on a more community-minded mindset, where we care enough about each other that we don't want people unnecessarily suffering simply because they can't be exploited for profit. But the capitalistic system that we live under does exactly that. And even though there is more than enough resources for everybody, it withholds those resources if people cannot pay for them. And not only is it wasteful to be throwing out food that could be feeding people, it is just unjust, and it's a very odd system if you look at it. And when we discuss things like this, I'm often met with people saying, like, that's the way things have always been and they always will be. You can't just get things for free. Like, there's a cost for everything. But humans didn't always live in a system like this. It's a relatively new thing when you look at how long humans have been around for. When we first originated, like, we were living in group, community-minded settings where everyone would have a job that would help the community thrive and flourish. And some of the really ancient signs of civilization, like, I remember reading an article where they were looking at humans from many, many years ago. And one of the first signs of like community minded civilizations were people who had injuries like a broken femur that had been healed, because in order for that to heal without the person dying, people would have had to take care of that person and bring them food and carry them around and ensure that they are okay. And in order for people like that to survive, other people would have had to step up and provide for them. And essentially that's what our society should be. And I'm of the mind where I know a lot of people, when you talk about work and like providing basic needs for people and not making it all profit based, people will be like, oh, well, then no one has any incentive to work. But I'm of the mind that like people naturally like to do things. Like they like to have little tasks and whatnot. But we have a society that's full of such burnt out people that if you gave them all of their basic needs and they didn't have to work in order to have them, you would see a period of time where people don't want to work because they're all so burnt out that they would need to rest. But if all of their needs are met and they contribute in certain ways just to create like a fair society, I do think people would return to work and there would be a greater amount of productivity if people weren't working themselves to the bone and being so burnt out. But as it stands now, most people are essentially signing their lives away to work, and they're spending more time at work doing something that they don't actually want to do than they do doing the things that fulfill them and hanging around the people that they love and just enjoying life. And that's what life has become, is it's become we're living to work instead of living to experience the magic of the world and do things that we love and that make us feel fulfilled. So it's a very interesting concept. And this isn't for me saying that it's an easy fix, that we could just uproot the society we've built with no repercussions, because I don't think that's accurate either. But I do think that we've created a world where it's making people sick. And I think that a lot of the mental health issues and a lot of the physical health issues we see would at least be dramatically reduced if we had a more human-centered society where people aren't having to abandon themselves in order to survive, because people can't put themselves first. They can't put their families first, and they can't truly look out for their well-being when they are essentially being coerced into working, even when they're sick, even when they're unwell, or even when they need space away from work, because if they stop, they will be evicted from their homes and they won't be able to afford food. And it's especially interesting because when we're talking about like motivational science, like I have in some previous podcasts, like people are living in a world where we're having a lot of negative reinforcement and punishment used. Like the entire concept of having to work in order to afford to eat and afford a roof over your head is negative reinforcement, because if you were to stop working, you're having those comforts taken away from you, and your life is going to get a whole lot more uncomfortable if you're living outside through the winter or you're going hungry. And so people feel obligated to work. And we've also created a world where there's a certain level of pride involved with how much you work, where people will brag about working excessive hours and they'll take pride in it and they'll have identity that's rooted in that. When it's a very weird thing, because we shouldn't be working ourselves to the bone or having no life outside of work just to survive, but it's something that's become normalized and it's almost being used as a status symbol. And it's all just very odd. So when we live in an environment like that, we are going to naturally project that onto everything in our life because it's the reality for us. And a lot of people don't spend time deeply thinking about how different things could be. So we have people who see no other alternatives and who have just given into the apathy of this is just the way things are, and who, if you suggest like, oh, but what if it wasn't like that, they actually get upset and enraged by the idea of things being different, because in my opinion, I think it stems from them having a certain level of pain and uncertainty. Like if we can't fix this, admitting that it is a problem means you have to deal with the pain of being aware of it, but unsure of how to change it and unsure if it's even possible to change. So a lot of people just double down into denial and suggest that there's no way out and that there's no point in even thinking of doing things a different way because they don't see any solutions. But I think these discussions are important to have because I think there are a lot of solutions if people just start thinking differently. Because as it stands, like everyone listening to this podcast and everyone on my page, realistically, they aren't the people who are perpetuating the system the most. The people who are perpetuating the system the most are multi-billion-dollar corporations and people who are hoarding wealth and resources to such an excessive extent that they are doing so on the backs of people who aren't getting enough. And it's really interesting because those people, I think, have seen like a type of soul death where they can't fulfill the hole inside their soul, and they're trying to do so with more money and more things, but nothing is enough, which is why they can never be satiated. And that's kind of where I think billionaires are at, is they've lost their soul and they are trying to find happiness and fulfillment by hoarding as much resources as they can and trying to maintain this status of being very, very rich, but it's not bringing them happiness, which is why no amount of money seems to satiate their desire to have more. And if you look at some of the stats, like, because a lot of people I find don't actually realize how much $1 billion actually is. Like, anyone who defends a billionaire is, they need to put on some clown shoes because they're being a clown, because no billionaire is even close to being like you or I. Even if you're in a family of millionaires, it's still so far off of being a billionaire. Like, the average person would be having to work hundreds, if not thousands of years to be making as much money as what a billionaire makes in a single day. So it's just very, very out of balance, and we are essentially serving these really greedy people at the expense of us. Like, it's literally killing people by way of stress, illness, mental health issues, whatever, right? Like, it is making people sick, and it's all for the benefit of the hyper wealthy that do not serve us or care about us. And they have control over the media, and they have control over the narrative of so much of what we hear, that they can maintain this belief that there's no way out and that this is the way things have to be, and that there's a level of fairness involved that is simply just not true, because no one needs to be a billionaire. There are no ethical billionaires. I don't care if you like Taylor Swift. She's a billionaire. She's not an ethical billionaire. You cannot be one, because you are hoarding such a huge amount of resources that even if you make donations to charity, it's not going to undo the amount of wealth that you're maintaining. And these people are trying to maintain the image of just being like your everyday average person when they are not that. Like, they're living in a completely different world, and some are better than others in terms of how generous they are with their money. But I would be cautious to even call it generosity, because they're hoarding enough wealth that like the average person cannot make it in their lifetime at all, much less in the time that these people are profiting. Like, if you're making millions of dollars each month, the average person is never going to make that in their lifetime, much less in a month. And so regardless of whether or not you like someone's music or the products they offer, I think it's important to look at it through the lens of like, this is excessive hoarding of resources while other people do not have enough. And there's not really any way to manage that ethically and not look at what they are doing, even if you like what the person's doing. Because I like Taylor Swift's music, but like, I think that she is trying to pander to her audience to appear just like them and make herself more human, like the everyday person, when she is not that. And there's a lot of good that she could be doing that she's not doing. And the same goes for a lot of celebrities and a lot of very, very wealthy people, where even just their voice is worth a lot. If they spoke out on social issues and tried to raise money, even if they were crowdfunding, but also with their own money, if they just spoke about these issues and tried to draw attention to what is going on in the world and the types of cruelties that their governments are inflicting on other areas in the world and whatnot, they could actually make a pretty profound difference. But they make the choice not to, because it would impact their bottom line and they wouldn't make as much money, even though they would still profit a ton. Like, it's not going to cause them to go bankrupt if they were to speak out about something like Palestine or anything like that, or talk about like residential schools, talk about decolonization and whatnot. If they were to use their voice to draw awareness to these things, they would see a hit to some of their profits. They would lose some followers, but it's not going to hurt them in the way that the everyday person would get hurt. So I think that we do need to be more critical of these people instead of kissing their asses effectively, because even though you can like aspects of them, I think we need to look at like how different they are from the everyday person. And as someone who like is like, my business is a corporation now, I incorporated 2 years ago, and It's crazy the amount of tax breaks that corporations can get that the average person can't. Like the fact that I can write off so much of the stuff that I do and do so completely legally and above board, but someone who's working a serving job or working as a cashier at a grocery store, they are oftentimes having to buy the clothing that they need to wear to do that and other aspects of like items that they need to wear to work, but they can't write off those things. And that's really unfair. So the amount of tax breaks that a corporation can get versus the everyday person who's operating as an individual working under a corporation is really, really unjust. And I've become more aware of that as I've navigated into that realm. And like, I do not make anywhere freaking close to the amount of money that these multi-billion-dollar corporations do. Like, I am like a peasant in comparison. I'm making pennies, not even that in comparison. So I can only imagine that the amount of tax breaks and write-offs and the amount of profit that they are hiding through those tax breaks so that they don't have to pay as many taxes. And it's really concerning because those taxes, if they were paid fairly, could go to help a lot of people. And that's why I look at this where it's like the way the world is functioning right now is unethical. There's no reason for a handful of people to be at the top of what is effectively a pyramid scheme, profiting to the extent that they are and having more money than entire countries do, while people are living homeless within the countries that these people operate in, mainly like in the US and Canada, which are viewed as first world countries. We still have a lot of homelessness and poverty that's not being properly addressed. So we don't even need to go look at poorer countries to see that there's a problem. And it's just continued to get worse. Like in my lifetime, I've watched the cost of living, even within the last 2 years, climb to an exorbitant extent, and they try to justify it off of inflation. But if you look at the costs associated with inflation, the profit margins have continued to grow despite inflation. So it is a manufactured inflation on the part of these corporations that are trying to profit and make more money. And it is just so unethical. And then people are working harder than they ever had, and they're barely able to make rent. Like the minimum wage is supposed to be the minimum wage that someone needs to be able to afford to take care of a family if you had a single breadwinner in the family. But nowadays, that's basically impossible to have someone be the single breadwinner in the family on minimum wage. And it's just such a crazy concept that things have gotten to the extent that they have. And it's just so incredibly unethical, and it's skewed all of our perspectives on this planet, essentially, where the media is trying to protect these people who are at the top of the pyramid at the expense of the many beneath them. And even the people who aren't making very much and who aren't billionaires, they have this narrative where they'll also protect those people who are hoarding resources and having so much wealth at the expense of those who are impacted by it. So it's really crazy because most of us are suffering at the hands of how the current world structure is functioning and the amount of greed that there is in the world. Yet so many people who are actively suffering from this will defend the status quo and see no issue with it. So it's all just like a really odd dynamic. And then I see it projected onto horses where people say that horses need to earn their keep and they need to have a job. And it's very odd because it's like when you choose to get an animal, like you shouldn't do so with it being transactional. And same with like people, like your friends shouldn't have to be useful to you in terms of like doing tasks for you in order to be worthwhile as friends. Like there needs to be mutual benefit in terms of like emotional support and just generally feeling safe around them and getting something of benefit out of the relationship. Because if it's a toxic relationship where the person's just draining you and treating you poorly, then that's not a fair dynamic. But if we operated with the mindset that in order to be our friend, that someone had to provide labor or be useful to you financially, that would be a super toxic mindset to have. And these types of relationships just shouldn't be transactional. But the type of relationship that a lot of people have with their horses is transactional, where they view it as their right to exploit the horse for whatever they want, and that the horse owes that to them because they're paying for their basic care that they took on and knew that would be required when they chose to get the horse. And it's a very interesting concept because it doesn't really make sense. if you get the horse, you know that you're getting a horse with the risk that they could become injured or have needs that require them to be out of riding at any given point. And if people choose to do that and then don't want to maintain their side of the bargain, which is caring for an animal that they chose to get, if that animal no longer is useful to them, it's a toxic type of relationship. And that's been really normalized in the horse world to the point where people will justify rehoming horses who are permanently lamed or injured on the basis of they can't ride them and they want a riding horse. Or they'll rehome horses who are too injured to ride at the level that the person wants and might not be super marketable because they have quote unquote quirks and issues that make them less desirable to people. And this is super normalized in the horse world where horses are viewed as more of a commodity. And I talk about this in detail in some of my recent podcast episodes on a good death, like humane euthanasia, and then also one that I did on selling horses. So I'm not going to go into detail about that, but it's a mindset that is very prevalent in the horse world. And I think that it stems from this capitalistic structure that we've developed in society. And honestly, I don't really know the full solution for it, but I think that developing a greater degree of empathy and understanding why the world functions the way it does and who it's benefiting is something that people just need to become more aware of, because most of us aren't benefiting from capitalism. It's benefiting the people at the top. And if we're struggling and having to work ourselves to the bone just to have a roof over our heads and just to feed ourselves, and we're having way more time at work than we are out enjoying the lives that we're living, there's a problem. That's not the way things should be. We should be able to live the lives that we want and to have a fulfilling life and to have free time and to be able to decompress and de-stress. And the fact that we've normalized prioritizing work to the point where our mental and or physical health is damaged is really unhealthy. And who does it serve? It's not serving ourselves. It's serving the people who are making money off of the labor that we provide. And this is kind of in part why I've tried to operate my business in a different way. And to be honest, the way that I function as a worker amongst my own business is unhealthy to my health in a lot of ways, because I'm doing a lot more jobs than a single person should be doing. And it does cause me a lot of stress. And it's something that I need to start to manage better. Otherwise, it's going to impact me long term. But with that said, I don't want to hire regular employees until I know that I can give them a good living and give them stability and also feel stable myself. So that's why I haven't done that, because I don't think it would be fair to do that to people. And I want to be able to pay them well and take care of them and offer them job security. So at the point that I can do that, I'm going to outsource more help. But right now it's not feasible for me as I navigate work life and just kind of figuring out what I'm going to do with my business and what my plans are going forward. I'm kind of fumbling my way through it because I don't really know what I'm doing. I'm not a business person, but I care a lot about the people around me, and I never want to be the result of someone not being able to pay their rent for the month. So when I'm thinking about hiring people, that's something that I'm really concerned about, and I'd rather impact my own health by working more hours and more jobs than what is feasible long term for one person, than take on employees and end up screwing them over if I have like a break in the amount of work that I have and I no longer need them to work for me and I cannot pay them through that period of time and still continue to keep them on the payroll while keeping my business afloat. And it's just not something that I would be comfortable doing. So I've made the choice to impact myself so that I don't have to negatively impact other people. And I also want to make sure that when I do hire people, that I'm paying people a fair wage, like a living wage. And a lot of businesses that are making the most money are the ones that are the most notorious for paying unfair wages, which is crazy because they have the means to pay people better. If we look at the top corporations, like especially grocery stores, what the CEOs of those corporations are making every year in comparison to the people who are working every day within those grocery stores to keep them afloat and to actually drive the profits and make it possible for these CEOs to profit anywhere close to the degree that they are. There's such a huge discrepancy, and there's people on the floor that are doing these jobs that are essentially holding the entire business together that aren't being treated like that. And they also are often viewed as unskilled laborers. Like entry-level jobs are often called unskilled labor. but all labor requires training. Like, you need to know how to do the job. So all labor should be viewed as skilled labor. And I find it so disrespectful that we have these people who are in these jobs that are being paid minimum wage, and jobs that, generally speaking, all of us need and that we rely on, like drive-through workers, fast food workers, restaurant employees, like people who work in like garbage disposal and stuff. All of these people are people that we rely on for our day-to-day lives, and oftentimes they don't garner the respect that they deserve, despite how crucial and essential they are and how often we use their services. And they're also often not paid to the extent that they should. And it's pretty insane to hear about, because there's a lot of jobs where I look at it and I'm like, first of all, thank you to the people who do these jobs despite how little they pay and like how difficult they are and like the amount of abuse that you have to take at that job, because these employees that are in quote unquote entry level positions oftentimes are super disrespected by people who come into to use the services, and they have to put up with a lot of BS. They have to be mistreated and work a job that's barely paying their bills and have to continue showing up day after day to work in that environment. And it wears on your mental health, because before I started training and doing stuff for myself, I used to work in food services. I was a hostess at a restaurant, and people degrade the shit out of you, like especially women. They feel entitled to making comments about your body. Like, there's a lot of men who be like, oh, you should smile more. And they feel entitled to telling you how you should hold your face and stuff. And there's just like disrespect. Or if like the kitchen has messed up an order and you're front of the house, people are going to be abusive to you front of the house because you're the face that they see. And you have to take the flack for issues that you didn't even cause. And that's also not to blame kitchen employees, because mistakes happen. Working in kitchens is very, very stressful, and they're human too. But what I'm saying is that people have to take abuse for mistakes that have nothing to do with them. Same thing if you're working in retail. Something could be out of stock and someone could lose their shit on you because they want a product really badly and it's not there, and it's not your fault. I've experienced it to an extent in my line of work. Honestly, like, most of the customers I have are very, very nice, but I had an issue recently where the shipping was miscalculated via Shopify, and the item was being shipped across the world to a country that I've never shipped to. And when I went to actually print the shipping label, the shipping cost was over $50 more than what Shopify had quoted. And if I were to pay that out of pocket, I would essentially be losing money. So I drafted up a new invoice and then contacted the person to tell them what was going on. And they were very, very upset and pretty degrading and rude to me over a situation that was just an oversight and a mistake. And the interesting thing is, like, with a small business, it's like that amount of loss to like a major corporation, like a multi-billion-dollar corporation, wouldn't be very much. But for small businesses, it does matter. Like, I notice every order I get, and it means the world to me, because it's what's allowing me to live. And every little purchase matters, even if it's only like a $20 purchase, because it all adds up. But big corporations don't even notice those amounts of losses. They don't even notice like thousands of dollars worth of losses because they're profiting so high. But this attitude where people are mistreating these employees and taking them for granted, or being really rude, or feeling entitled to having people pay out of pocket for their order, I think it oftentimes stems from having dealt with major corporations where you can do that and you can get away with it because they're more willing to pay out of pocket to give you something, where the mindset is, oh, it's their mistake, so they should have to pay for it. But when you maintain that perspective with small businesses, you are having an attitude that if everyone tried to do the same thing as you would put people out of business and entirely bankrupt them. And it's just not very fair. It's treating people as if they're inhuman, and not considering how your behavior and actions are actually impacting their well-being and their business. And you see it a lot, especially any jobs where people are doing customer service. They have to take on other people taking out their bad day onto them, especially if there's any mistake. And even if it is that employee's fault, it can be a pretty minor mistake, and the intent isn't malicious when making mistakes, but then they are treated as if it is, and they have to take on these other people's anger. And I think even just the amount of anger we see in the world today and how easily triggered people are stems from how little fulfillment people are getting from their lives and how stressed and overworked people are feeling. Because when you're having a really bad time and there's very little in your life that makes you happy, you're more likely to get triggered by having to wait longer as like a slow cashier at the grocery store learns how to do their job because they're in training. And you're more likely to be frustrated by that. You're more likely to get angry at construction workers for slowing down traffic on the road when you're in a hurry to get to work and are panic stricken about being late. All of these little things are more likely to cause a major reaction because they're the result of trigger stacking, where you have a lot of other things going on in the background that are causing you stress. And then the final thing that creates a reaction might seem very small on its own, but when you're dealing with all of those other stressors, it's an awful lot. And that's the reality of the world we're living in, where people are under so much stress that it can take very little to set them off. And then their anger and frustration is taken out on those around them. And none of us are immune to doing this, because all of us can get triggered and end up snapping at people who we care about, or even people, even strangers who don't deserve it, without being aware of it at the time. And it doesn't justify the action, but it's just to point out the fact that most of us are living in chronic stress. And I've said this before in other podcasts and other posts, but if we were to get someone to walk around the average human environment and look at things through the lens of, if you're like a zoologist who is determining whether or not the care is ethical and whether or not the needs are met and whether or not welfare is adequate. If we look at all the problems that we're facing in the world, it's very clear that there's a major welfare issue that is like so widespread across so many different countries and so many different parts of the world and all different types of people, that there's significant welfare issues that are ongoing. And it's very clear because of how much people are impacted and affected, and how many mental health problems and physical health problems and how much escapism there is. Like, it's just, there are so many clear signs that human welfare is not doing well because of how the world is functioning. And it should be a sign of a failing society. But since profits for certain people are high, there's this narrative that's being perpetuated that it's totally fine and there's no problems and there's no trouble in paradise. But whose paradise is it? It's not the everyday average person's paradise. And even for the billionaires, I don't think they're having a good time, because they can never be satiated. Nothing's ever enough. They don't have empathy for the people around them, and they're being very selfish. So honestly, I don't even think they're happy, because if they were, they would be satisfied and they wouldn't keep needing more and needing to up prices, even though they can see, or they should be able to see, how it's negatively impacting thousands of people around them. So I think, like, basically most people are struggling to an extent, and that there's so many things we could do to improve human welfare that aren't really being taken into account, because the economy and like profit is what is being prioritized, instead of like whether or not humanity is actually thriving. Like, even if we just look at the prevalence of mental health issues, if we look at the addiction crisis, where I live, which is outside of Vancouver, British Columbia, Vancouver's a port city, so there's like a huge fentanyl problem here, and there's such a big overdose problem downtown, and the homeless problem downtown has gotten so much worse over the years. I have a really hard time being in the city because it's just so sad to watch. And like, even today, it's cold and it's rainy outside, and I could spiral being very upset about the fact that there's people who are literally having to live outside in this. And imagine how hard it is to stay warm, especially if your clothes get wet at all, because it rains so much here that you can't just hang them to air dry. You can't dry your clothes. You can't have proper shelter. And even like downtown, police will raid tent cities and kick people out and destroy their belongings, like the few belongings that they have. And it's not fixing the problem, because these people have nowhere to go. They have nowhere to go. They're just going to move somewhere else, also outside, because they have nowhere to go. And there's such a lack of humanity, where people will look at people like that who are struggling and suffering and be like, oh, just get a job. They're so lazy. Like, this is disgusting. And there's like a level of dehumanization that is just so cruel. And is so out of touch with reality, because you can't just go get a job without an address. You can't just go get a job when you don't have a proper resume and when you don't have anything on your resume. And you can't just go get a job when you don't have anywhere to shower or clean up and you don't have clean clothes. Like, these people are stuck in the situations that they're in because we offer them such little resources. But if they had access to shelter, if they were allowed food, if they were given a warm place to live and a warm shower and clothing to use, and they were given their basic necessities, they would be far more likely to, one, not need to resort to addiction as a means of coping, because at its core, addiction is rooted in trauma, and that is like a hill I'll die on. It's supported by lots and lots of psychology research, and the people who claim that it's just a choice are oversimplifying the issue and are being intentionally obtuse. I have a very close personal relationship with addiction because one of my family members has struggled with addiction, and he's sober now, but he had an addiction to heroin, so opiates. So I intimately am familiar with those struggles, and it's something that I have seen firsthand. And I've also seen how people sought out to dehumanize people like him, and it just puts such a bad taste in my mouth looking at those attitudes behind it, because it's just so uneducated. And also, the people saying these things don't really show any interest or take any initiative in actually learning about the people who they want to vilify, criticize, and claim are lazy. But the fact of the matter is, even the sheer existence of addiction, it's an escape behavior. It's people trying to cope with a level of stress that they cannot cope with sober. And behind virtually every single addiction is trauma that led them to there. And then once you've lost your home and you've lost everything and you're living outside in terrible conditions, honestly, I don't blame people for continuing to use, even if it doesn't make sense to other people, because how do you cope with a life like that? How do you live outside in the cold and the damp in the wintertime and see no way out of that situation without seeking out a coping mechanism that can take you out of the excruciating moment, even if it's just for short periods of time? And can you really blame people for doing that? Also, all of these people that we see who are homeless that society likes to try to write off as being humans, every single one of them has a story. And if people actually made the effort to listen to them and actually hear what they have gone through and what led them to being there, it would be very telling, and people would quickly learn that it's not the story of someone who's just lazy and who has made the express choice to live in that way. It's someone who has been struggling internally and externally for years and who has been led to that situation because of the circumstances of society that make it likely to have that happen. If you don't have a family who's going to step up and take care of you when you can't be productive and money making for society, or if you're struggling with mental health or physical health issues that make it very hard to be a, quote, productive member of society in the way that a capitalistic society demands. And all of these people have a story. And I think that going out of your way to judge someone who is in a vulnerable position and who is already struggling when you refuse to hear where they're coming from and understand their perspective, it's just a really disgusting thing to do. And it's really cruel. And like, I think the dehumanization of people who are suffering in that way is very like deliberate attempt by the people who have the most to gain by exploiting the labor of those around them. It's a deliberate attempt to just basically have that ever-present threat be very visible to people who are working for them. Because you can walk through virtually any city and find people who are homeless and struggling and look at them and go, well, at least I'm not them. At least I have a warm place to go. And people use that as reference for like what you should be thankful for. So it's like this ever-present threat to remind you of what could happen to you if you suddenly are no longer able to work to support yourself. And I think that it's actually to the benefit of these corporations and these major billion-dollar entities that are exploiting people the most, because they can use that as a threat to scare people into continuing to be compliant and maintain the current status quo and show up in society in the way that they have been. And like, that might be like a conspiracy theorist to some people, but I think it's totally viable, because I don't really see like why we're doing so little to help people. And people could blame the expense of things, but I don't think that's a viable excuse, because there's a lot of money that's put into things that are less helpful. Like, even just like with Canada, we send off a lot of money to other countries, like foreign countries, to engage in war efforts. And we're not taking care of the people here. And this isn't to say that in like legitimate cases where people are needing protection, that countries shouldn't outsource and help other people. But a lot of these imperialistic countries, when they're sending money to other countries to support war efforts, it's actually to target and attack marginalized groups of people, not help them. So this is like a long-winded rant, and you can tell where I lean politically. Like, first of all, I don't think politicians are actually going to help any of us. I don't think that we can vote our way out of the problems that we have. I think that we are intentionally put into a system where we're made to feel helpless and unable to get out of it, because a lot of these countries like the US and Canada are effectively like a two-party system. Canada is less two-party system than the US is, because we do have a third primary party that's a little bit more viable, and then we have like independent parties and whatnot. So there's more parties available, but there's two major parties that essentially always win. So it's not dissimilar to the US, but the US is especially bad when it comes to a two-party system. And there's this entire notion that if you don't vote within that system, like if you voted for an independent person who you agreed with more, that you are wasting your vote. And I think that is an intentional move on the part of, again, like the people who have the most to gain financially from the system that's currently being applied, to make people feel helpless. And like, we're told we live in a democracy, but we really don't, because there's this narrative that you have only two choices in order to have your vote matter. And it's true to an extent, but if people started to break free of that and just vote for who they wanted, you could see it change. But people feel stuck, and they want us to feel stuck, and they want people to feel helpless and trapped in the situations that they are, so that they maintain a certain level of compliance. And it's really sad, because like none of us are like gaining much out of this, and there's things that we could do to make the world flourish and also help the environment, because a lot of the stuff that's impacting the environment the most is at like to the benefit of billionaires and major corporations. And we've just created a world where we get put on this planet basically to work. Like, even schools and like the way kids are educated, and like the length and time that people are at school, and like homework and stuff, I think to a certain extent the structure of that is to prepare people to be exploited in the workplace and have it feel normal to them. Like, for myself personally, in school was a bit of a struggle because of how it was set up. It was very hard to sit for like 6 hours a day and focus and listen to people talking all day, and then also be given homework that I had to remember to do. And it's like really interesting, because you're already at school for a very long time. And if you look at the studies that they've done on the school system, it shows that like a lot of kids' ability to focus and actually retain information is greatly reduced after like a few hours. And that if we had shorter school days and perhaps less days per week at school, that people would actually excel and they'd learn better. So there's ways we could shift the way that we do things to better help students learn, but it's not happening because the current setup, I think, is such to enable the system that we're in and to make it feel normal when we do go into the workforce, so that people question it less, because it's prepping you throughout the entirety of the school day. Like, I think back to it, and it's honestly wild to me that I was spending 6 hours a day at school with like a 15-minute recess and like a 45-minute lunch when I was like as young as like 7 years old. Like, that's a lot for a 7-year-old, and it's just wild to me. And a lot of it is about like book smarts and being able to test, and you're basing people's intelligence on their ability to conform and reproduce work in testing situations. And again, I don't know what the full solution for this is, but I know that the system that we currently have isn't working, that a lot of people are falling through the cracks and being negatively impacted by the way things are, and that it's not fair to them, and that in theory, I would imagine there's a better way of doing things, because saying that there isn't is assuming that we've managed to create everything so perfectly that there's no room for improvement. And I really don't believe that, especially with the current levels of poor welfare that we're seeing in people. So inevitably, all of that challenge and all of that societal conditioning is going to be perpetuated in other areas of life, such as the horse world. And I think that we see a lot of these same problems, like all of the welfare issues that I talk about. My issues that I have with the FEI and other similar organizations, the issues that I have with upper level riders and what's winning at the upper levels, I think it's all interconnected with these types of issues. So while this podcast might seem heavy on non-horsey subjects, what I want to say is that I think that all of these things are interconnected because they've contributed to creating attitudes where people aren't questioning the way that we do things and where people aren't questioning what we've normalized despite evidence that it's harmful to the masses. And there's so many studies out now about horses showing the harm that we're causing them in modern horse sports and showing exactly what we should alter in order to make it better for the horses. And yet there's so much pushback and there's so much denial and there's so much lack of acceptance, and there's a big emphasis on maintaining things the way that they are in order to maintain the status quo and also not impact profits, like stuff like harsh bits and like draw reins and other training aids. There's this huge industry behind that that's making lots of money off of that. So there's monetary incentive to maintain those and to keep those legal. Like even with dressage and other disciplines, something as simple as changing the rules relating to nosebands and making it optional to have a noseband, it would impact the bridle industry because it would make nosebands obsolete to more types of people because there's a relatively high number of people. Like it wouldn't even be close to half, but it's enough people where it would change what is being purchased. And same thing with if bitless was allowed in these disciplines, it would alter sales for certain types of businesses that are specializing in that. And if they were to make certain types of bits illegal, it would change the sales for certain types of businesses. And I bet if you looked into the companies associated with those businesses who are profiting the most off of those, they probably have some level of stake in the competition industry, and they probably have their fingers in the pockets of people higher up in the show industry. And there's probably some level of connectivity between those things where there's incentive for people to maintain certain rules and certain belief systems and mindsets in order to avoid having things shift in a way that would result in a reduction of profit. Like it's all very profit centered, even the young horse classes. And before I say this, I want to say that I understand the challenges of breeders and that breeding can be very expensive and that it's hard to produce nice horses and make a living off of it. But the young horse classes are such to make it so that we can see young horses doing as much stuff as quickly as possible, whether or not it's good for the longevity of their careers and their physical health or not, so that more profit can be made off of them. And also because people enjoy watching bigger athletic feats sooner than they would like if you were just doing like the 3-year-old dressage classes, if they were actually just walk trot and the horses were going in long frames and not being bunched up, or if they were just in hand classes, people wouldn't want to watch those as much. It wouldn't be as interesting to them. And if they did away with the 3-year-old classes altogether and instead shifted it to be older riding classes like 5 or 6-year-olds, what that would mean is there'd be an extra few years where these horses are not engaging in competition and are less sellable, or you can't sell them for as much money because they've had less stuff done with them. So it would shift the entire industry. And like the same thing with like horse racing. If we moved the age of starting racing up a few years, what it would mean is that these breeders would have to retain these horses for longer, which costs money. So we need to find a viable way to shift these things if we're going to maintain having horse sports while understanding the impact that it could have for the people involved. And with that said, like I don't care if a billionaire sees like a profit hit, but the everyday average person who is not exorbitantly wealthy, who could end up losing their home because of these changes, we need to factor in their well-being in these cases, regardless of whether or not you agree with all of the things that they do. And with the amount of money and wealth and access in the world that's being withheld or like used for profit, I do think there would be ways to make these changes without screwing people over completely and without having it really negatively benefit the horses. Again, it's such a complex issue that I can't provide like a surefire solution, and I don't think it would be fair to put that onto one person, but I think that these are just conversations that we need to have so we can start to discuss a way out of the world that we're in and a way into a more holistic world that serves people and animals better. because I think that's where we need to be headed. Like, in my perspective, my dream world would be having people live on like a commune style thing where everyone has their own job, and you have like, you're growing your own vegetables, you're raising your own animals, and everyone is contributing their part. Where if there's kids on the property, people are sharing off on childcare to take the burden off of just like a single family, and that everyone is contributing a piece to help maintain the survival, happiness, and well-being of everyone involved. And like, that's kind of how I think society should be run, is like where we're all helping and working together as a collective to help people as a whole be happier and have their needs met, and where the people who are less physically able, for whatever reason, where they are taken care of, and where they don't have to maintain the same jobs and systems as those who are. Because I'm not going to get deeply into this, because this is a whole can of worms that I can open, and I've already been talking for so long, but like disability, for example, like the disability payments that are given out by the government, like my dad's disabled, his disability checks, like, you can't freaking live on them. Like, it's crazy how little money it is. And with how the cost of living have risen, like, I really sincerely don't understand how people even manage to keep a roof over their head, much less feed themselves, when that's all they're getting and when they're physically unable to work. And it's really unfair to those people that they're put in that position in the first place, because like anyone could become disabled at any time. And even with the stuff that's been going on down south in like Florida and whatnot with the hurricanes, like, something I had never considered is how difficult it can be for disabled people to evacuate, and how little help there is for them. And that's something that we should be considering in our system, where we're not letting people fall through the cracks just because they aren't like as exploitable for labor and whatnot. Like, we should be helping people, especially the most vulnerable people. Those are the people who should be helped first, and who should be taken into consideration, because they're less able to help themselves in ways that an able-bodied person might be able to. And they're largely forgotten. And even with like infrastructure, like, I follow like quite a few disabled influencers, and a lot of them have made the point that there's ways that you could build like buildings and hiking trails and stuff to be more accessible, like even just using ramps instead of stairs. And like, able-bodied people can go up a ramp easily, and it's less exclusionary. And it's something I've started noticing more and more because of that. But I already did notice it to an extent because of my dad, where there's things where when we take him places, it becomes imminently obvious that it's not accessible. And it's just crazy to me, because it's like relatively easy to put into practice as a whole if you just like consider these people. And this is also why like our governments need to be more represented by different types of people. Like, we need people from all types of backgrounds to be involved in making decisions, so that they aren't forgotten, because a lot of these marginalized people are forgotten by the government, because people who haven't had to deal with those challenges just don't even think about it. Or even if it's brought to their attention, they greatly downplay the level of difficulty or the lack of access, because it's not something they have to think about. And I think that's something that we all need to be conscious of, because when you don't have to personally struggle with an issue on the day-to-day, you don't realize how much it would impact you if you had to struggle with that, and how little help there is for you. And it's something that's like a reality check, because if you ever end up in the position where you do have to consider it, because now it's happening to you, it is a big shift where you just go, whoa, like, this has completely uprooted my life, and now everything is so much harder. But what if it didn't have to be that way? What if you were considered more? And what if people were all working together to help the collective? And that's really the world I would like to see. Like, I'm not sure if it's ever going to happen in my lifetime, but I really do hope that that's what we move towards, where we're just being more considerate of all people, and where the world is being run in such a way where it's for the greater good of humanity, and it's not just for the profit margins of a select group of people that are such a small group, but maintain so much power and resources that their existence is occurring on the backs of a lot of other people who are suffering. And that's not ethical, and it's not just. So I encourage people to look at like the way the human society runs and how it might influence your perspectives in horse training. Because I think that that's also why positive reinforcement and rewards-based training and the idea of paying your horse to do things is something that enrages some people. Because the idea of giving their horse autonomy and rewarding their horse for work and making things more enjoyable for the horse and giving the horse more choice, I think bothers people in a way that they cannot actually comprehend at the time until they open their minds more, because they don't have that amount of choice. Like humans, I feel like we have the illusion of autonomy, but we actually don't really have autonomy, because in order to actually live and survive, there's societal rules that we have to follow. But the problem is that there's a lot of people who cheat that system, and these rules aren't applying to everyone. Like even if we look at the legal system, any type of crime where you just get fined for committing it is really only a crime for poor people. Anyone who has enough money to easily pay off that fine without issue can commit that crime as they want to without repercussions. And we don't have, at least here in Canada and the US, the system is not such where it's like a sliding scale where the amount that the fine is in accordance with your income. Because if it was, then it would be a little bit more fair. But as it stands now, there's certain things that are in place where you only get fined for it. And then it's only really a crime for people who cannot afford the fine, or where the fine is high enough that it actually impacts them. And that is a really interesting concept that I was also introduced to from people online talking about it. But my perspective over the years has really shifted the more I've talked to people from different backgrounds and heard about the ways people who live differently than me suffer, and just found more community where people are talking about like how unfair things are. And like, this isn't to go off on a tangent where I'm complaining, but it's to expose the reality of the situation. I don't think that we should just suck it up and be working hard days because that's the way it is, and just be working incessantly nonstop just because that's what we've been taught is the societal norm. I don't think we should have to settle for that. I think we should be trying to improve society as we learn more and learn about the impacts of the way that things are. And we're seeing so much behavioral fallout and general health problems from the way that things are. And it's showing us that things aren't working for the greater good of everybody, that it's only for the greater good of a select few. And even then, that's debatable. And I think that we should be talking about that and exposing the issues. And I think that the fact that talking about these things enrages so many people, especially people who are affected negatively by the way things are run, I think it speaks for just the sheer amount of conditioning that has gone on and how hard people are willing to fight to not accept that and to not admit to the reality of the way that things are, because it's such a painful thing to do. And like becoming more aware of it has been a blessing and a curse, because it's a blessing in that I've been enabled in being more considerate and compassionate of people, and it has kind of lit a fire in my soul where I want to make changes and I want to see the world become different and become a better place. But it's also a curse because it's very depressing and sad to come to terms with that. And it's not like a pleasant thing to be in when it looks like there's so much work to do and it feels hopeless to really make major shifts because of how the world is currently functioning. So it's a really difficult and complex issue. And like, this has been like a tangent that I've gone off on where I've referenced horses very little, but I hope that people can understand where I'm coming from and like make the connections that I'm making and see where I'm coming from with that, because this is kind of how I see things. Is I want to understand why people think that the way they do, why the world functions the way that it does, and who it's serving. So it's something that I think deeply about, and I look at the interconnectivity between all of these power dynamics and societal norms and how they impact the way we perceive everything. And we have started to view these things as just like normal human nature, when I think that it's really not. And I think that the entire concept of like a billionaire is something we need to be heavily studying, because the psychology of that is very interesting to see like how people can get to the point where they care so little about others that they're willing to take way more than what they need at the expense of the masses and do so without caring. Like that is disease in itself that should be looked at, because it's such a disordered way of thinking. And like humans are a social community minded species. And it's like, how did we become like that? How did things things get to the way that they are, and how can we make things more ethical and equitable, because I think we desperately need to for the benefit of everyone. I've recommended this book a few times, but I really like Gabor Mate's writing, and The Myth of Normal is a really interesting book where he talks about all sorts of different mental health issues and like the societal implications and like how they're created. And essentially the general gist of it is that there's a lot of autoimmune disorders and like cancers and illnesses that are contributed to a lot by stress. And in theory, if we started to address the collective stress that people are under, these things might become obsolete, or they'd at least occur much, much less. And it's very interesting, and there's actually scientific merit to it because there's studies that are showing these connections. So if anyone is interested in reading that, I highly recommend it. I loved it, and it really changed my perspective. And it's something that I've read within like the last 2 years that has really helped me understand myself better and find more comfort in the way that I view the world and have it be validated through science as well. So I would recommend that. But there's also a lot of good books. I can post my Audible library sometime because I have a bunch of things saved on my wish list that I want to read. But that's one of the ones that I've actually read that I can recommend. But anyways, I've been talking for a while now, so I'm going to cool it there and just say thank you for listening. And I hope that this helped some people or it resonated with some people. Definitely let me know your thoughts. As always, I really appreciate any podcast suggestions that people have for me, and I'm always open to new things that I can do or any suggestions, and it's so appreciated. I've been super busy and like life has been really hectic, and I've been going through transitional stages in my life. So I've been having like a harder time doing podcasts more regularly until recently, but it's something that I want to do because I find I can talk more and articulate my thoughts a lot better on podcasts. And it does seem to resonate with like a decent number of people, which I appreciate, but it's also cathartic for me. So I really like doing it, and I really appreciate everyone that helps support me by way of listening to the podcast, downloading it, like reviewing my stuff, and shopping at my stores, purchasing webinars, doing anything like that, subscribing to Patreon. All of that stuff is really helpful, and it's been crucial to helping me catch up with like finances and whatnot after my move, because that was really hard for me, and it impacted my sales and just made a lot of work and just things difficult for like the last couple of months. So I'm catching up now and things are going better, and that's really great. So for anyone who's interested in checking that stuff out, all of my links are going to be down in the description of this podcast. I just released some fall themed apparel, like equestrian apparel. It's got horse skulls on it and it's really spooky and fun. So if that's up your alley, please check it out. Again, I really appreciate anyone who supports my business because it allows me to do what I'm doing. And I have really big goals and things that I really want to do to help and to like put forward the changes and shifts that I want to see in society within the best of my ability. And like my primary goal long term is to try to be able to afford properties so I can basically make like a holistic sanctuary and like rehabilitation and like center for people to go to like connect with horses and other animals to heal themselves and just kind of do my part with that. But I'm not at the point business wise where I can afford to purchase property. And I also want to get to the point where I am stable enough financially where I can do more to help other people and offer more incentives to help other people. But I'm not there yet. It's been really hard to get to where I as is. And it's just been a lot of work because I come from a family where we financially struggled for a very long time. And there's been a lot of hardships and traumas and issues that have just been really hard to navigate. And doing all of that while running a business has meant that I've made a lot of mistakes. And I've also just not been able to take off the ground in the way that I might when there's less risk involved financially. So I've had to play it very careful, and I'm getting there slowly but surely. But I really want to start making more grounds and movement to really start to chase those dreams and make them more tangible and within reach. So everyone who listens to these things and supports my business in any way, it's so appreciated. And I really I'm thankful for that. So for anyone interested, check out the links down below. I'm currently trying to save for Gator or like some other type of similar farm vehicle so that I can use it to pick paddocks and feed hay, because it's gotten so difficult to push a wheelbarrow through the area when the ground is really saturated with water. So that's my newest thing. So if you're interested, you can subscribe to Patreon for as little as $1 a month. And everything helps and it's really appreciated. And I just wanted to thank all of you for listening to my thoughts, and please let me know what you think and if you have any recommendations for future episodes. And I love you all so much, and I hope everyone is doing as well as they can be despite how hard life can be. Thank you so much for tuning into the Making Milestones podcast this week. If you are interested in ways that you can help support the podcast, it would be greatly appreciated if you would leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts. Reviews help to promote the podcast in the algorithm, allowing me to connect with new listeners, and it is so greatly appreciated. Some other ways you can help to support the podcast include subscribing to my Patreon channel, where you can subscribe for as little as $1 a month and access monthly Q&As, behind-the-scenes content, training help, and more. Every subscription helps, and they help to offset any costs associated with the podcast, allowing me to keep most of these episodes ad-free. I also have an online store where I sell equestrian athletic apparel, graphic t-shirt and hoodie designs, horse bridles, both bitted and bitless, and you can check that out in the podcast description as well. Lastly, I have my main website where I have a bunch of webinars with different types of training topics, and where I also offer online training consultations if you want a one-on-one appointment with me. All of this helps me continue doing what I'm doing, and your support is so appreciated.